everybody who's attending this fine little facility and demonstration of composting products, especially on the island of Bainbridge Island. It's nice to be part of a community that's very forward-thinking and tries to really play out their ideas, not only personally but in the commercial fields. So basically, as part of the community, my name is John Barutt. I'm just a master composter at the Bainbridge Island Library, and they needed somebody there to do a lot of composting of all the fine horticultural material that has been always cut and piled and tried to be neatly arranged, and we try to do something with it. And of course, due to the efforts of Anne Lovejoy, who's done many, many years of gardening and is known for her work at the Bainbridge Island Library also. She'll be, part of our discussion. But I just want to briefly talk about what exactly is composting. And a lot of people just should realize that when we're looking at all this greenery around us, we're looking at all the plants, and of course what's underneath all the plants? It's soil. And so you have to realize there's two entities here that are always going, which always, every year people will get, every season, they'll get to their special place, either with their own experience or their special gardener or facility, and get new plants, get new fertilizers, go through the routine of taking care of, clipping and trying to judge what kind of a plant we may want to get. And then as a side thought sometimes, they'll throw something down on the ground, got a little fertilizer down there. And it seems like sometimes I hear this and it's like soil is an aside, but it's actually quite an important part of gardening and good horticultural and agricultural growth and health. So basically, what are we doing at the library? We're just taking all this material, and basically you can split most material up into two major areas. One that's very colorful.
Right, go on.
Like I said, very colorful.
A little bit closer.
A little bit closer? Yeah. Okay, great. All right. Like I said, everything that's a little bit colorful, all the brighter colored vegetative matter is something that is primarily nitrogenous. And then we have other pieces of plant products, black, browns, beiges. They're like branches, old leaves, things like that. Primarily those are carbonaceous. And all what we're doing is we're taking a mix of all the nitrogenous and the carbonaceous products. We put them in a particular kind of a blend. We put them in a very safe, secure little place that is just basically kept moist enough, think of a wet sponge, and they're covered to get warm. And why is that? Because what is going on? Who's doing the work where all of a sudden we have all this nitrogenous and carbonaceous material, and all of a sudden, a couple of days or weeks or months later, they're turning into these fine, broken down material that we commonly call soil. Well, what's doing this? It's microbes. And basically microbes that are found in the soil. And so basically what we have to do is let's just be aware of the communities at our feet. It's these microbes that are all part of this cycle of life where we take plants, when they break down or die and pass down into the soil, the microbes will take them over and break them down, turn right back into soil, and it's the fertilized soils with the various kind of soils that you want, all of a sudden provide the nutrition for new plants to grow again. So that's what we're doing essentially at the compost piles at the library, and we assist in trying to keep the garden going as its own community. And so just as much as we try to keep the library going as a community for readers, we want to have the garden and the composting to be its own community for demonstrating good horticultural health. Yes, Anne gets to step in here.
So one of our goals is to make a closed circle, like a circular economy. So one of the things we do is not take away most of the material, but reuse it right on site. And in your own backyards, this is something to think about, that there are lots of different composting systems. They can be very complex and scientific, which is awesome if you're a retired engineer, or they can be extremely simple if you're a mom who's got little kids at home, and they can be passive if you're older, like some of us. and you just want to be able to layer stuff in a corner somewhere. All those systems are applicable in your own backyard, and a lot of them are extremely accessible for anybody of any age and ability. Even if you're living in an apartment, you can actually have like a teeny tiny compost device, I call them. Really, they're like little tumblers or things like that that you can fit into a deck. So you can compost almost anywhere, and almost everything that you're going to eat or that you're gleaning from your garden is going to be compostable, right? I think that's an important piece. One thing that you want to think about, though, is if you've got worms and worm bins, there are things that you don't want to put in your compost because they will kill the worms. For instance, if you're not buying organic oranges and you put orange peels in, well, the peel has a great deal of pesticide in it, but same with bananas. Non-organic bananas, lots of pesticides, the worms will die. So you want to be very careful when you're feeding others that you're giving them food that's accessible for them.
Okay, very good practical knowledge. That's really necessary because that comes into what generally after I try to do some kind of presentations, we'll have a Q&A session. So if there are people who have questions about what can they do for composting, please ask us and we can go forward with that. Now when we notice everybody who's showing up here, we have now commercial organizations or institutions are now getting into the recycling aspect, but also we're trying to consider also the practical issues of conducting a business. So you have to remember that composting, recycling can start being one and the same, and it can affect businesses very profitably, very positively, and not create burdens. And I think that's what we want to do for people, is to realize that we'll let Mother Nature do a lot of the work. If you add a little bit of practicality to your techniques, as Anna mentioned, it can be inexpensive, it can be done by anybody, and it can be safe. But just, have a few rules in your head, and you're basically on your way. So, basically, Anna, anything else? I'm at the point where generally I would be open to questions because I don't always know what my audience is. Sometimes there are people who are extremely experienced, and as mentioned, those who are in the commercial end of it. I'm more of a scientist, and this has been kind of fun for me. But I generally handle a lot of the family and maybe small institution kind of composting. But there's a lot of the basic knowledge goes throughout all composting, no matter how simple or how complex the system is. So any questions for either one of us?
I spoke with someone recently who said she's tried several times several different home composting systems, and she always ended up having to worry about varmints. And so what could you say to that? What advice would you have for a home composter?
Okay, that's a very good question. Whether, quite remarkably, it's the same kind of questions that are asked in rural areas, but also like in places like the city of Seattle.
Repeat the question.
Okay, and the question was, with her particular, no matter what kind of a system that she's working with, she ends up getting varmints. You get creatures going through it, and that's the same in places like the city of Seattle, or even if you're out here in the forests, in Bainbridge Island. This is my best answer. First of all, I had the example that there's a gentleman who does composting near the Congregational Church here on Bainbridge Island. And I can remember walking through, and I remember seeing all his compost piles, but there were particular corners where it was written in Thai language, the Buddhist admonition of, let it be. And I began to realize there were rats in particular parts of the compost. And I had to take a real good look at it. Wait a minute, they weren't foraging, the larger ones. They were all females. And you know what they were doing? They were raising their young. You have to realize that particularly rats are particularly aware of poisons, anything, traps, whatever. But if a mother is willing to raise her family in a particular part of your compost, that is a safe, organic. I know it sounds a little bit like a weird, horror movie, But mothers are the same of all species. And all I can say is that Mother Nature is telling you that what you are making there is natural. You have to remember, some compost doesn't go all the way to making it turn into black soil. You have to sometimes have compost that's partially broken up. It's like got straw, bits of fruit, anything. That's the kind of compost and soil you want to use for your winter gardening. So compost creates a wide variety of soils, but it also creates a wide variety of environments that creatures want to live in. So it's not a criticism of you, it's a compliment to you, and you've got to let it be. Anne.
So if you don't want to let it be, and not everybody does, and some of the critters are on the larger side, there are enclosed systems that, like the tumblers I mentioned, which are much less accessible for things like raccoons and so forth. Also, generally speaking, a raccoon or a rat is much less interested in what's coming out of your garden than what's coming out of your kitchen. So when you think about food scraps, there are a couple really good ways to handle that. One is to have a food processor and grind it up, because very few creatures are that interested in slurry. They may drag off half of an eaten something or other, but they're not going to eat slurry. And you can also make little trenches in your garden, or even in your garden beds or your window boxes for that matter, and pour slurry into it and cover it with soil. And again, that's not attractive to very many creatures. So there's ways of making sure that what you're composting is not drawing in the whole neighborhood, right? Because that, for many of us, that isn't that great. And we don't necessarily want the raccoons around the children, for instance. Or raccoons also leave droppings that are not good for critters to be, other animals, pets, to be around, as well as people. So there's that kind of layer. But also, when you're thinking about what critters are drawn to, it can be warmth, as John said. I had a really interesting experience with rats moving into my car because I was parking next to my compost area, which I do not recommend, because they like warmth and security just like we do. And so part of that is like making sure that if you're creating a compost area, it's in a place where there is, if it's going to be accessible, it better be safe for everybody. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And obviously, Anne being the gardener at the library, she deals with reality and practicality, whereas every place I go, I turn into a laboratory and I just kind of expound a lot of theories. But again, it just goes back to your question. It goes back to your question. It's just, don't be surprised if you see a lot of Mother Nature getting involved. But that is a very good question. And it's just, again, the thing about also, when I talked about good composting can also involve some kind of security too. You're keeping, like I said, everything wet to a certain point. But I also recommend, particularly in our Pacific Northwest weather now, really cover things with it can even be cheap, worn out tarps or something like that. And that does, believe it or not, helps provide some control. Sometimes foraging animals or whatever, they might go, well, it's a little difficult to get, they may go on. And if it's stuff is tied down a little bit, that'll slow them down a little bit. But again, I have no complete answer to it, except for getting the enclosed kind of, you can go to any website, and they do provide for these enclosed systems where these huge tumblers or tumblers that you can push around on the ground. I think one place was, there's a beach area that actually it has tumblers. Found in a lot of the places where Bainbridge Island Parks and Rec have these gardens. And a lot of the people there will have their various tumblers there, as well as huge compost piles or systems. The other thing too is that the tumblers are easier to use, but they handle smaller amounts. So it's a practical question, when you're dealing with things like this.
I also wanted to address a little bit the question of compost and pollinator patches. So many of us are really interested in preserving and nurturing bees and other pollinators, and we make pollinator patches and we go to all the trouble of planting all these wonderful herbs and native plants that the pollinators will like. And the thing about that is, that's great advice, but a lot of native bees have a very limited foraging area. Like honeybees can go a mile or more, but many of the natives only go a few hundred yards. And if they find a juicy pollinator patch that they're going to make their home there, and their home is usually in the ground, in hollow stems, tucked under leaves, or in other words, incorporated into the matrix of their pollinator patch. And if we go into those pollinator patches and cut everything down to compost them, that actually kills a lot of the creatures that we're trying to protect. If you dig, you can do more damage with a shovel and a pair of pruners in a weekend than you can kill literally thousands and thousands of little helpers. So instead, there's a whole new composting system which I call benign neglect. And what it means is leave it alone, right? And really leave it alone. If you have to cut it, you just cannot live with it, cut and drop. We do chop and drop and just cut it, let it fall where it is. And you can put a light layer of compost over the top if it's really offensive to your eyes, or a light layer of chips, for instance. But if you layer on deeply chips or compost, you will actually smother the burrows of all those little native bees. And there could be literally be hundreds, if not thousands of them in a fairly small garden area. So to preserve the life of the creatures, I think, benign neglect, or think of yourself as a beneficial slob, right? And if you have problems with that, pushback from family or neighbors, get some little signs that say nature reserve, habitat protection, or pollinator patch. And maybe that will help open an opportunity for a learning conversation about why we don't disturb the soil too much.
Any other questions?
I would ask, is my compost going to be really acidic if I'm putting a lot of coffee and citrus into it, and should I adjust the pH before I apply it to the garden?
Good question.
Very, very good question. The question is, the gentleman is putting a lot of certain kind of materials with the coffee grounds, et cetera, so either pine needles or whatever, is that going to make the compost too acidic? Well, there's two ways of addressing that question. Number one, when you do get something, down here, got this mask on too. I don't want to shock anybody here. Let's see, you've got two ways of doing this. Sometimes when you put in even highly acidic material, and again, like if you are doing citrus, make sure that it's either very well washed or it is organic, because the pesticides, it's amazing how they'll hang in there. But if you start putting in a lot of this acidic material in the compost pile and you store it in, it is amazing how quickly the microbes will be attracted to that material, break it down. It'll return back to more neutral levels, 6.8 to 7.2, very, very quickly. It's surprising. However, there are techniques that I've used where if I want to have something slightly more acidic or alkaline, I add those materials to my compost pile, mix it in thoroughly, and then take it to the area where you're going to be, where you either have plants growing that prefer, like azaleas, you can tell what the pH was by throwing it on the azaleas and see what the petals look like. So there's two ways of doing it. It will break down eventually due to the microbe activity, but if you want to get something like acidic compost, lots of pine needles, lots of coffee, ooh, fantastic, that they love that. Or start a vermiculture pile with worms and coffee grounds and eggshells and lots of paper, and create this lasagna-style compost. They love that stuff. Absolutely love it. So there's many different ways of handling your material, but I'm glad that you asked about coffee grounds. And coffee grounds, by the way, I know they're brown, but they're considerably more nitrogenous than carbonaceous.
Coffee grounds are also pretty high in nitrogen. And so in one way, like usually we're not looking at compost to be real feeding mulches as much as some people think. Most compost does have nutrient quality, of course, but generally speaking, they're not highly nitrogenous. But when you do use a lot of coffee grounds, and at the library for many years, we would go to all the coffee stalls all over town, get those used coffee grounds, shake out the papers because they didn't used to be all good, the kind of thing you'd want to put in your pile. And then that compost actually would break down, and as John was saying, it buffers naturally to a pretty neutral pH, generally speaking. But if there's a lot of coffee in it, it tends to be quite nutritious. And there are plants that love straight coffee grounds, like tomatoes. It fights early blight. A good mulch of used coffee grounds will help prevent a number of diseases and still be adding nitrogen and composting in place, which is another thing to think about. Like, you don't have to only put finished compost on your plants. Some raw compost, and John can talk about this, are going to be so active breaking down that they'll actually harm plants because they're still in that breaking down process. But things like coffee grounds will actually be a beneficial kind of mulch. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so basically we're dealing with very active time periods when you are putting fresh material together. If you have it covered, and again, once again, you just have just a slight amount of water because the microbes require that for the activity. We've had compost piles go from 90 degrees Fahrenheit to 150 degrees Fahrenheit just within 6 hours, I'd say. So it's really there, and sometimes you really have to watch out when you are taking very active piles of compost, and you can identify it by if you take the cover off and you get smoke or steam coming off, you've got a lot of activity there. I'd say go ahead and take some of that material and create some new piles to break down other non-matured material, or you're putting it someplace where you've got either the seeds are durable to handle that kind of activity, or a plant that's ready to go, okay, feed me now, and it will handle it. So remember, you want to have a better understanding of soil too when you are making compost, because you're creating a wide variety of compost for what? A wide variety of either seeds or plants at a particular stage in their lives. So it's a good question, and you're creating more questions as you ask, as you get the answers.
So another use for hot compost is what used to be called a hotbed. And in the Victorian periods when greenhouses weren't heated because it only had little stoves and things, you would put a layer of manure, hot manure, a layer of very hot compost, and then cover that with soil, and then plant into that. And the heat from that degrading layers would actually literally heat the greenhouse and promote root growth in those plants. And then by the time it rotted down, it would be feeding those plants over time, right? So you can still do that at home. That's something I've done on occasion. Also, another really good use for very hot compost is killer compost, where you have an area with persistent weeds, or you have an area with problem plants, and you actually want to get rid of them. Or maybe you're going to make a new bed and you just want to make sure it's clean. You can put very hot compost down, even create compost heaps on that, sheet composting, and compost in place. Rake off the top layer, and you will find that the soil underneath has opened up, the worms are doing the shoveling for you, and that is ready to be planted a season later, usually I'd say 3 to 6 months. Wouldn't you?
Any other questions? You've been an attentive audience. This is fun.
Just use a common question.
Oh dear.
So in apartment living, how would you recommend composting for somebody that is up on a higher level than the ground, has an outdoor deck?
Yeah.
Would it be safe to put your compost box outside, or would animals then try to help themselves? I mean, what's the best way to go?
Okay, great question, and I've gotten this a lot in Seattle, but basically for people who live in apartments, townhouses, condos, whatever, and you're going to be doing your gardening or out on your decks, and can you adequately carry on composting in your outdoor decks? You most certainly can. And again, we can refer back to especially those small enclosed devices, whether they're balls or they're tumbling bins. They've got some that are built so small that you take small amounts of your material, do the tumbling, compost comes right out, and you can just basically add it to small amounts of soil Yeah, that can be done, and it's done particularly many places in the city of Seattle. It's encouraged. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of, many years ago, I was a member of an HOA, but there are now organizations where HOAs encourage people to, if they've got outdoor gardens or if they've got gardens on their decks, they encourage it. So you can do it, and the secret is to do it in small quantities. And I think basically if there's any, when you're building up so much extra soil, you can always ask within the HOA to say, look, I've got some excess here. Can we help somebody else in the condo or the apartments, whatever, take some of it over to somebody else? So you kind of share the wealth. But it can be done. It can be very easily done. Part of the secret is keep the areas small. If you're the kind of person who can't bend over, go ahead and have a raised bed. But have the raised bed, put it on stilts or whatever, and have like a foot deep or whatever of soil compost. You can grow plants in there very, very efficiently, or in pots. So you keep things at a minimum, but you can do it on your decks. So there's no problem with that.
We're going to talk about bins and boxes, those seated bins.
Oh yeah, and there's also for people who want, we talk about microorganisms doing work in making compost, making soil. Worms, it's in worm bins, they are even more efficient. So a lot of times the worms, because they're very mobile. Just basically, you take boxes and you put have holes in them. Basically, the most ideal I have found is approximately 55 to 75 degrees at range. But the closer you get to 55, make sure you're out of wind. As you get closer to 75 degrees, make sure the box is out of the sunshine. So you want to try to be kind of in the middle of that range. But again, wet to the point it's like a wrung out sponge. But just create layers, a lasagna of like paper products, newspaper, eggshells, things like spinach, grasses, leaves. It's so easy. You make the products be a little smaller, a little flatter, so the worms can crawl in and out of it. Oh, shavings, be easy though if you're using citrus shavings. They can be a little acidic, But so worm bins are a very effective way of creating not only compost, but you can add the worms themselves to soil that you've created. And they'll just you'll create not only more worms, but they will actually be accelerated composters also. And you can always do this in a small enclosed area. So it's also very practical.
And that 55-degree number is kind of a magic number. It's the average temperature of soil around here. And it's also the temperature at which plants like tomatoes and so forth will grow or not grow. So when plants and temperatures fall under that range, that's when a lot of tropical plants will struggle, and that's when the worms start to go dormant. So you want to keep it kind of around 55, but if it's a hot summer, you want to shelter those worm bins from too much direct light, because if they get too hot, they'll go dormant or die too.
Yes.
So how would you suggest if somebody brought home one of these home compostable containers, the best way to have them disintegrate in your home compost?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Oh, this could be fun.
Oh, these are good.
These are great.
So,
I'll let you first, then I got my ideas.
Okay, so what I do with these is wet them. I soak them in, like if I'm washing dishes or anything like that, I'll throw these in the sink and get them wet. And then they can usually break down pretty well or into smaller pieces. I've successfully composted this kind of thing, actually, and these too, in my own composting bin at home, which is pretty small, because I live in the mobile home park, and it's a pretty small site, and it's a pretty small composting area. But again, wetting them and shredding them makes a big difference, and they'll break down a lot faster. The ones that are a bit spongy, almost like this, tend to break down really quickly. If they're a bit slick, you want to make sure they're not plasticized. But if they're just waxed, that's okay too. They'll get eaten up and break down really fast. Same with these cups. The No Tree Compostable, A lot of times if you just throw this in, it will still look like this in 6 months. If you soak it and shred it, it'll go a lot faster.
Okay, so I think that's the secret. Remember, any kind of composting, the larger the products that you start with in composting, the larger the pieces, the larger the amount of time it will take for it to be broken down to compost. But the smaller the pieces are when you start your composting, the smaller will be the amount of time it takes to get it to composting. So that's a variation you want if you're just dealing with just the idealized form of compost. Now, when you're dealing with, again, if you want to do, you're in a condo or in a small apartment, and you can't create all these huge worm bins, you can use things like this or like this. So you can, create a worm farm in this too. Make sure you got holes in it and make sure it's soft. So go ahead and choose your size, and they'll go from one of these, stick a couple of these together. They'll go from one bin to the other. That doesn't make any difference for them. But all of these, cut them up or get them wet and let them break down. These are a great thing to start with. Another thing too, I know some people get really fussy, especially when I'm dealing with other scientists and engineers. They like to stabilize some of their compost piles or like this. Sometimes I've used things like this. You cut holes in the bottom and you stick them one next to each other and they create little air vents. So if they're doing these huge, now by the way, I highly recommend don't go any larger than a cubic yard or a cubic meter in covered at-home compost bins. You get anything larger than that, you're dealing with something I'd rather talk to you about. There's other much larger techniques. But one thing with people who go larger and larger, creating places for aeration, people have used these and hooked one to the other and they create aerations in the compost pile because they really can generate a lot of heat. And the other thing too is, again, you might get a rat or two in there, but they're creating their feces, their activity helps stir up the compost pile, and small animal feces are very quickly destroyed by the microbial activity anyway. So anyway, so you use your imagination when you're dealing with material like this.
One thing, shredding anything, like big leaf maple leaves are another issue for a lot of people because they really take a long time to break down. Or the leaves of English laurel, for instance, some of these big waxy leaves. And by shredding those or cutting them in smaller pieces, you create a lot of edges, and edges are where the microbes get a chance to work. They can start much easier. And like if you throw a whole cup in, it takes a long time for an opening to develop. But if you've shredded it, or same with those big, heavy-duty, thick leaves, you create many opportunities to attack. And so that is a way to make sure that your compost moves a little faster and you're on the side of the microbes. Does that make sense?
Surface area.
Yeah. That's it, surface area, exactly. More activity, more surface area, yes. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Okay.
What about like the different wood composting in your home compostable bin?
Different wood?
Yeah, like a birchwood fork or something.
I would probably just say that, again, it's a matter of, this looks like this was developed, that it can break down. The water, it'll absorb water fairly quickly, therefore it will break down a lot more quickly. Now, you may be dealing with some other, there can be other woods that are found like cedars or alders breaks down pretty well. Cedar is a slightly different animal, dogwood slightly. So I would say keep the pieces small and readily soakable. It's something like this. But generally, a lot of times when you're dealing with things like, let's say, bigger pieces of wood or logs, there's a gentleman, an Austrian, who's developed a system called hugelkultur. And what he has done is he's literally taken logs, like the logs that are broken down, and he's created bins with all these breaking down logs. So you let Mother Nature break those logs down for you, but it creates an informal way of holding all your other compostable material. So that's kind of a larger version of this. But I'd say the more open, the more softer the wood, it's more likely to compost faster. But do wet it. Do wet it. The harder woods, I'd say probably use them for structural purposes for building a compost pile. Just as valid. Yeah.
That's birch.
This is birch. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I'd say fast. I'll have to admit I haven't worked with birch that much, but no, that's true because you take a look at the trees themselves, that'll give you an idea. But this'll just the feel of it. This will break down quickly and have it soaked. You know.
So if you walk out this door, you'll see birch trees right out here, and you'll see where the branches have fallen and broken into multiple pieces and already are starting to break down just in a matter of weeks or months. So birch is one that is actually really easy to break down. And for something like this, you know, if you've got grandkids, give it to them and they'll break it, right? Or you can crush them with rocks, or you can break them with your fingers, but they will break down quite quickly. And again, soaking is really, like you might, after an event, collect all this flatware in a bucket of hot water, right? Well, you could do that with this kind of stuff, and by the next day, you could put it in, and they would all have swollen up and be ready to be compostable. Does that make sense? So yeah, wet and small shredding is always good. Destruction, you know, you're helping the destructive process along.
Another thing I just thought about, Anne was talking about children, but I don't know, if you live close to the water, and seagulls and crows will do the strangest things with oyster shells and clam shells or clam. And so they think that they're going to break these oysters or these clams open by dropping these things either on your head or on the property off the roof of your house or wherever. Those clam shells, oyster shells, fabulous compost material, particularly if you know that your compost bin has got too much acidic material. Excellent alkaline addition. So you're dealing with byproducts that we have on our beach. Another one that is usable, do ask the private property owners or the local tribes if there's a lot of broken kelp and it's not really being used, or if it's not being used or it's a small particles of it that you're not really going to be doing too much damage to the kelp systems, you can pull some out and throw that into your compost bin, especially if you're starting a new one, or if you want to do something like vermiculture, one layer, one little piece of kelp, that'll set everything off so quickly. So there are particles of this and that can be left around, like in communities like us in the Pacific Northwest. You can take advantage of them.
Is that kelp acidic or alkaline?
Acidic.
Another thing to think about with shells is that our soils here up in the maritime Northwest are pretty low in calcium, and shells are an excellent source of calcium. That's why we only have native, our native snails are all water-dwelling snails. All the land snails we get are imported, thank you so much, from mostly California and other places. And they often have thinner shells here because they don't get that much calcium. But for things like if you have squash that are always getting powdery mildew and so forth, it's usually a calcium issue. So adding crushed shells to the compost is a really good way to buffer some of that as well.
Okay, I'm trying to quickly think of anything that's so off the wall, but actually it's quite practical. Yeah, just thank you for the questions. Anything else? Yeah, go ahead.
Any recommendations where you could go and get these compostable little boxes?
Do you know, go to the web. There are so many websites right now that they have a wide variety of bins, systems for bins. They design for like bigger projects, or for people who live in a condo and they don't have a lot of room to work with or a lot of personal strength. But yeah, there's a lot of out there that is quickly accessible, and they'll take your money real quick, believe me.
Local nurseries.
Oh, and of course, I'm sorry, local nurseries. She would know about that. I should be aware of that. But local nurseries have them too. But
Did we not answer what you were asking?
No, I thought you meant boxes by those boxes and not compost boxes. So.
Oh.
And there's any kind of a box. It's like, Christmas time, the kids will go after the boxes, not the presents that you actually gave to them. And it's like, you just put boxes out there. You can lay them out there and throw compost in by the side or something if you want to, or put a bunch of them together. And some of the boxes can be open for a while. Some can be solidly filled with compost. Again, you might get a few critters, but that's a way of getting something going, especially if you're in an area where lots of rock, lots of debris, you sometimes give nature a chance to intervene too.
If you're using cardboard boxes, you want to be really careful that you're not using those that have plasticized paper wrapped around them or on them, because that, of course, will just contaminate your growing medium, your soil, and your compost as well. Where you often rip those off, and unfortunately they're just trash. But the cardboard itself, for the most part, will break down really well. Some people have had concerns about the glues that are some of the different kinds of cardboards, but for the most part, a hot compost pile will break down those glues.
Yeah, it's amazing what heat can do. Even some of the most powerful industrial, like Gorilla Glue or something like that, you get to a certain temperature after it's been used and it's actually sealed or it's accomplished its job. It does have a safety factor that once you get above a certain temperature, even that glue will break down. So there are advantages to using composting if you realize you've got a lot of, let's just say, material that you're not totally sure about. You can always have a segregated pile someplace and just mark it as segregated pile and let that compost fire off to an extremely high temperature. I've gotten, there's one time at Picardo Pea Patch in northeast Seattle, we had an area where they were really worried about certain areas was there soil that actually was real close to an old gas station location. And so what they wanted to do is, it was now here in the corner of the Picardo Pea Patch, they started doing this, non-food only plants for composting. And it's amazing what I'm trying to remember if it was the University of Washington, did some soil sampling and they found that there was a lot more breakdown of hydrocarbons, ones that, are the kind that we really don't want to be around that often. So composting has been used in many forms for remediation.
At the library, we were building beds over an area that had been a car auto repair place, and so there was a lot of contamination in the soil, and we sent samples. Will you talk about this?
Yeah, one thing along with composting is that there's also, I think, many people, there's a local author who's become quite internationally known now, Paul Stamets, Fungi Perfecti, and we discovered that in soil itself, and this has been kind of ignored for at least about 100 years. It seems like the oral traditions or the rural traditions are making a comeback, but fungi and mycorrhizal fungi, the fungi that grows subterraneal, is actually part of this growing system that we have between soil, plants, and the fungi will literally cover the roots of these plants and will actually enhance their ability to fight off disease and then also to grow. Well, there was a particular part of the garden area where we were just having great difficulty getting plants to really grow in a healthy manner. And we did contact Fungi Perfecti. They do it, they're in Olympia, but there's several other organizations where they grow specific species of fungi that naturally grow in the soil. There's even around here in the Northwest, and they get them specifically strained out so you have the raw fungi. We took a couple species that I knew about, we put it in the soil plots, and lo and behold, the next year, we were being able to grow plants at an incredible rate. Now that's something that can be added to. It's a soil amendment. It's not per se composting, but composting would encourage the growth of those mycorrhizal fungi. So again, the more questions you ask and the more you discover about soils and plants, you're starting to discover things that maybe our grandparents and our great-grandparents knew about, but it's been kind of lost in the transition of the 20th century.
Any other questions?
Fantastic.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And if you have more questions, you can show up at the Bainbridge Public Library any Friday morning, unless it's snowing, between 10 and 12, and we will take you on a tour and talk about compost anytime.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.